Lisa Hunt. I am the rector of St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Houston, and I prefer to be referred to by Lisa.
Hello, my name is Scott. I also prefer to be referred to by my first name, not Lisa, but Scott. And despite any perceived images of how we are distinct from one another, we are all beloved children of God, just as you are.
And I am Carlye Hughes. You can call me Carly. I am from the Diocese of Fort Worth, where I serve as rector of Trinity Episcopal Church.
I want to begin by thanking you all for your generous hospitality and kindness. It's a vulnerable thing to be up here and offering oneself for the ministry of Christ Church at this exciting and troubling time. One of the things that makes it so engaging is to know that I have friends that I don't know who have prepared a place for me in the name of Christ. I feel welcome, I feel cared for, and regardless of the outcome, I know that the Holy Spirit is among you and alive. We are surrounded these days by abbreviations. BFF, BTW, LOL. You only live once, but the one that scares me the most is you're on your own. YOYO. This attitude permeates our culture. Just this morning on NPR, listening to the news, a young reporter was being interviewed about the critical reporting work she had done out of California in their recent fires. And she said, when it really comes down to it, you're on your own to survive. And I thought, God help us if that's true. She, of course, wasn't recognizing the cop that just was interviewed or the fact that people came to retrieve the folks that were floating in the swimming pool. We are not on our own. As people of Christ and those who walk in the knowledge that God, the Holy One, is moving and alive on this planet, we know that the power that moves and sustains us, in whom we have our being, is ever present and ever capable and ever enough. Just this past Easter season, we had a reading from the Gospel of John that I want to call to mind. Jesus reminds his flock that he is the true vine and that we are the branches. And he declares, apart from me, you can do nothing. Apart from me, you can do nothing. For me, the implication is also, in Christ, we can do most things. The church is under great change and stress right now, as every institution is, whether it's our democracy or our families. We're living in a time of radical change in which the strains of human kindness and hope are frayed. But as followers of Christ, we know that the power to remain and redeem are not ours. The Holy Spirit moves and is among us and is sustaining us in hope and love. I think this election is an opportunity for you to claim your branchdom. You are branches in northern New Jersey of the witness of hope and redemption, of reconciliation, and of embrace of diversity of all sorts, of confidence that together we are powerful because God moves in and among us. It takes a different kind of leadership, I think, to lead in these sorts of times. We're no longer an astute and revered tradition. We're no longer counted as the Republican Party at prayer. If you We're no longer the Church of Presidents, although many frequent St. John's. Instead, we are a pioneer people that are living on the verge of a new thing that God is doing. Reasonable and smart and creative and imaginative, knowing that the power flowing through us is more than we can create on our own. I am a builder. I build communities, I build hope, I build connection. I build endowments, I build buildings, and I live in them when they're destroyed. If you call me, you're calling me because you want to build, not maintain. I'm a creative person. I'm all about what is not yet and what could be born. I trust in imagination, and I like to invoke and evoke it in others. I want to play with ideas and possibilities. I want to fail, and I want to succeed, and I want to do that all together. If you want to be told what to do, if you want the 9-point plan for success that will bring us back to the church in 1956, I am not your gal. I am a collaborator. I like working with other people. I like engaging them relationally. I love to do that pastorally, and I love to do that through planning and ministry. If you want and need a lone ranger, or someone that's coming in with the wisdom of God in his or her mouth, I am not your girl, or your woman, or your bishop. You need to look for someone else. What I will do is work with our community of the diocese to listen deeply, to synthesize, and then together cast the vision that we will work on over time, being open to newness of spirit, but knowing that we can't be who we are if we're changing that identity moment to moment. I believe in casting a vision and making it plain, and in endurance and perseverance. If you don't want a vision, if you don't want to be part of it, do not elect me. You have a choice, oh Diocese of Newark, who you want to be and who you want to become. The church, the Episcopal Church, has always counted on you to be courageous and be willing to go to edges and to tell the truth in love and to take risks. I invite you to live into your charism in this election, knowing that God is with you always, even to the end of the age. Thank you.
You all have just a sliver of time with us this afternoon to get to know us before you have a very important decision to make. And I'm glad I'm not having to make that decision with you in a few weeks. I'm aware that you all have a lot of information about us on paper. Some of you have probably trolled us on social media as well. I would probably do that myself. We have a lot of information about you from your profile, from your website, from the interactions we've already had with those that we have interacted with through the search process. But you all don't really know us at an emotional or intuitive level, and we know from research that's where most of us make our decisions. And so we know that these walkabouts are really important for that reason, not just for you all, but for us as well. And so I'd like to use a little bit of my time to help do an exercise that I use with groups when I'm teaching about courage and vulnerability as agents of relationship building and transformation. And I like to, when I'm having to be vulnerable in front of a bunch of people, I like to get them to be vulnerable with me. So this is your opportunity and invitation. So I'm going to share a number quickly of vulnerable life experiences of my own, and I'm going to invite you to raise your hand if they also apply to you. Now, the good thing for those of you who are going to be watching this online after the fact, no one's going to see whether you raise your hand or not. For those of you who are here in the room with us, if you so choose, that is your choice, to raise your hand along with me, then we will have a connection. We'll also, whether the other candidates choose to participate is up to them as well. This is totally voluntary, but I will be raising my hand with all of them. So I do have a list. We'll start off a little bit easy. Raise your hand if you sometimes eat more chocolate than you probably should. For those of you not seeing, there are a number of hands in the air. Raise your hand if you sometimes look at People magazines in doctor's office waiting rooms. Raise your hand if you have ever missed a meeting that you scheduled. Raise your hand if you are uncomfortable having your feet washed on Monday, Thursday. Raise your hand if you are uncomfortable dancing in public. Next one's a little bit long, so bear with me. Raise your hand if you have ever struggled with one or more of the following: overeating, alcohol use, tobacco use, drug use, internet use, gambling, shopping, video gaming, or social media use. Again, many hands. Raise your hand if you are a cancer survivor. We're almost done. This is a tough one for some of us. Raise your hand if you have a tattoo. Yes, there are Episcopalians that have tattoos. Last one. Raise your hand if you got married on October 12th, 1985. And I see one person, and that is my wife, Becky Slater. Thank you for your willingness to be courageous and vulnerable with me. We all know that it takes courage to be vulnerable. And we know that Jesus was a very courageous individual because Jesus knew how to be vulnerable. Jesus invites us to be courageous and vulnerable as well. And so when we gather weekly to receive word and sacrament, Jesus then tells us to go. Go make disciples of all nations. Go share God's love with all people everywhere, no exceptions. Go! And so we are all part of a movement that our presiding bishop calls, a borrowed term, the Jesus movement. So movement is an important part of my spiritual life. Some of the ways I experience Christ most deeply in my own life are when I'm walking our dogs every morning, taking long hikes in nature, walking across the Diocese of Maryland as a fairly new staff member 6 years ago to experience the Diocese beyond our church walls. Walking across Spain 2 years ago with thousands of other pilgrims on the Camino de Santiago. And most recently, leading prayer walks in Baltimore City to places where people have died from gun violence, remembering them with our prayerful presence by praying for them by name. If you all were to call me as your next bishop, know that I will not sit still. It's just not in my nature. I will walk this diocese, and I will invite you to walk with me. And we will experience Jesus in unexpected places along the way, because a diocese is much bigger than a collection of church properties. What we do on Sundays means little if it doesn't impact who we are as the body of Christ beyond the walls of our churches the rest of the week. And if that resonates with you, then I'm excited and encouraged at the possibility of serving as your bishop here in the Diocese of Newark. Thank you.
I want to thank you for the great honor and privilege it is to spend time in discernment with you and with these good colleagues who I realized earlier today are so much more than colleagues, have become real friends and people that I have great love and affection for. Something about walkabouts does that to a person. Big word. And yesterday I was asked, as we all were, asked a question that stayed with me answer that. If you've read my materials, you know that's an easy answer for me. But it stayed with me, and I started thinking about it in terms of the Diocese of Newark and who this community is to God. And in part, that comes from the image that came to mind, comes from my time living in New York. I probably have spent more of my life living in the Northeast, though I grew up in Fort Worth and now serve in Fort Worth. I came here shortly after college, and my first apartment was actually in Jersey City before I moved to Manhattan. And when I lived in Jersey City, one of the things I knew I needed were multiple ways to get in town to guarantee that I was where I was supposed to be on the day and time. And most of the time, I could count on the path, but I had to have a New Jersey Transit backup, just in case. And it was also helpful to have a car, in case everything fell apart. Yesterday, as we were headed out to Church of Our Savior in Denville, I learned that 80 can be a disaster. So it's really good to know about 24 and 46. It's good to have those alternatives. So one of the ways I see you is as a hub transporting people into their spiritual life, connecting them to other people, connecting them to God, and the way we sometimes need multiple ways to get where we're going. People need multiple ways to be in their spiritual life and to be with other people. And that is a gift that you bring to the community around you. I also see you as a haven because you are so wildly diverse. And you guys are quick to talk about your racial diversity, your socioeconomic diversity, the diversity that I hear you rarely mention, but for me, kind of driving around your diocese, the diversity of the land, the geography, and what that means for the people, how life is very different in the western part of the diocese from the eastern part of the diocese. That a small church in an urban environment is experiencing different things than a small church in a rural environment. That incredible diversity, not only do you have that, but you are in relationship with each other. That you're in community with each other at a time where as a nation and as a world, we are separating as fast as we can from difference. Where we have retreated into likeness to the point of tribalism that we hear talked about as a given anymore. That tribalism has become normalized, normative for us. And you are doing something that I think in most people, in their heart of hearts, wish they knew how to do. You come together with people who are not like you on a regular basis. You know about those people, you pray with those people. If you're really good Episcopalians, it means you eat with those people. But you're in relationship together. And I wonder if you see yourselves as visionary by being a hub and a haven at this particular time in the history of our nation. Because that is visionary work. It is work that I love. It is work that I'm extremely attracted to. There are plenty of dioceses searching for bishops right now. There was only one I was interested in. That was you, because you're doing the kind of work that is important to me. My mother said that from the time I was a young one, a really young child, that I always had a flock. I was always bringing home a gaggle of people that needed a friend, that needed a place to belong. That thing that you do with your hospitality, it is about more than hospitality. You give such a deep welcome. You welcome people so well that they know that they belong. They are not tolerated, but they are members of the community. They have full status and belong among you. That is something I relate to, and that is vitally important to me. One of my greatest joys is watching people when they step into that thing that God has gifted them to do in a way that nobody else has that same gift. I was thinking about this. I was trying to remember, because that's been a lifelong thing for me. It's been across the ways I have answered vocation in my life, whether that was in the secular world or the church world. But one of the things that I remembered was at 23 receiving a letter from someone that said, I gave that business a try because you told me I could do it. Thank you for believing in me. And at that point, I was sold on coaching people for the rest of my life. I was sold on being with people and encouraging them into something new. And there is something that is so wonderful about helping someone discover their gift, empower them, and resourcing them to do it, and then watching them soar. It is absolutely a beautiful thing to do. And we share the same passion for justice making, which rounds out that hospitality. You know, any second grader can tell you that we hug the people that we love, that we want to take a stand for the people that we love. And when we make justice, it's because we love another person. We want to figure out the ways to do that with somebody else. I think it's an exciting time. All of us think it's an exciting time in the church. We're not naive. We know that it makes everybody nervous where we are. But the thing that we're identifying, and the thing I think that you are also identifying, is the Holy Spirit is busy doing her work among us, making us aware of needs beyond our doors, making us aware of what it is God wants us to be engaged in and what God wants us to be doing. That's an exciting time for us as church, and I think it's a great moment for Episcopalians. Because this gift that we don't even see as visionary, this gift that we don't realize is so important, is a gift that people are not only hungry for, but they need the safety of in a time when being other has become incredibly dangerous. I am so humbled at this process of being with you and being with Lisa and Scott as we think through the possibility of being the Bishop of Newark. I know my husband, who is sitting back there very quietly, David Smedley, he cannot stand the attention, but I have to call him out every single time. Because for 18 months, he's been discerning that call with me, saying, isn't there anybody else you can talk about this with? So thank you for being the people that I can talk about this with, and I look forward to the rest of the afternoon where we talk more.
Scott, you've disclosed that you are in recovery from an addiction. Would you please speak to that addiction and your recovery?
So as you all would be aware from reading my essays, I allude to that twice in my essays. What you may not be aware of is that a little less than 4 years ago, in the Diocese of Maryland, where I serve, our then Bishop Suffragan, Heather Cook, struck and killed a cyclist while driving drunk. What you probably would not have any reason to know is that I was the person that the police department called to pick her up that evening and bring her home. One of the reasons I believe that she called me as opposed to a family member or someone else, although I don't know this is my assumption, is because she knew I was in recovery and she needed to find someone safe to ask to be with her in that moment. I was that person. That was a very traumatic time for us in our diocese, as you might imagine. It was very traumatic for me personally. When that happened, I'd already signed up about a month earlier to go to Texas to have some continuing education on a workshop facilitated by Brene Brown called The Daring Way, her method methodology. In fact, that's where I met Lisa Hunt. We were both on that training together. And so when I went to Texas 6 weeks after the accident, I had no idea how that training was going to help me personally heal from that incident in our diocese. How it was going to invite me into a new part of my ministry by integrating my own personal history with addiction with my leadership role in the diocese. And so what I discovered in that is how to talk in a public setting like this about my own story of recovery. So I'm very specific when I say I'm a survivor of addiction and a person in recovery. And some of the work Brene Brown has done in her research is to distinguish how people do self-talk around shame versus guilt. Shame is identity-based behavior, identity-based vocabulary. Guilt is behavior-based. So, for instance, I'm also a cancer survivor. I would never have considered myself cancerous, although at one point I have not been for over 10 years. But hearing that is very different than hearing cancer survivor. And so some of the work that the 12-step community is doing, based on some of the more recent research around the neurobiology of addiction and just other awarenesses we have, is to I realized that some of the terminology that was developed over time with the early days of Alcoholics Anonymous can actually be harmful to people in their early days of recovery and cause relapse. And so some of my advocacy work, both in the recovery community and also as a member of the diocese that had a very traumatic incident, is to talk in different terms about what it means to be a person in recovery. And so I do like talking publicly about what it means to be in recovery. And so for me, that means a variety of things that impact my life, not just based on the behavior that I left behind. And so for me, that means I exercise regularly, but not obsessively. I'm careful with what I eat and drink. And for me, that means no alcohol, no sugary drinks, no caffeinated beverages, and no soda. So for me, it's almost always water, with the rare exception of sometimes having a cup of Irish breakfast decaf tea. I'm really feeling wild and crazy that morning. I'm also careful with internet use. I also avoid going to casinos and bars. I make sure to go to my 12-step meeting regularly and stay in touch with my sponsor and be connected as a sponsor to others. My wife and I intentionally hug each other every morning for around 30 seconds because we know that that's a positive way to seek dopamine as a pleasure sensation. There are positive ways to do that.
Yes.
And when we're not too tired, we also do a slow dance before bed, but never in public. And so one of the things I'm very aware of when I became a potential nominee in this diocese is that you all had to, and for you all I mean first the search committee and then the standing committee, had to make a decision as to whether they felt they could trust my own integrity in recovery with what they knew about me in order to move my name forward in the process. And so I can assure you, the standing committee and the search, especially the standing committee and the president sitting in the room, did a lot more vetting of me than our diocese did with Heather Cook in our process. We've learned from that, and I feel your diocese has done a good job with that. So if you have any questions about my addiction and more particularly my recovery, I ask you to put your trust in your search committee and your standing committee in that role. So thank you.
Thank you. With youth becoming more vocal around issues such as guns, equality, and the environment, how would you support and lift up their voices?
So some of you have already asked me about my orange ribbon, and it's the color for preventing gun violence because it's the color hunters use when they're out in the field. And so that's become a fairly universal color for people who are trying to support the prevention of gun violence. So as I'm sure you've already heard, I lead prayer walks regularly in Baltimore City for places where people have died from that. And one of the great joys of my personal life a little over a month ago was to participate with my 20-year-old son in the March for Our Lives in Washington, and to hear those high school students so articulately and passionately talk about how their lives have been impacted by that. Choked up. It was great hearing Jennifer Hudson sing too, but it paled in comparison to hearing the leadership that those young people were demonstrating to us and modeling to us in this day and age as not only future leaders in our country and our world, but current leaders in our world. And so any ways that we can give voice to youth without having them have to go through such a traumatic experience is only going to make our world a better place.
And this is about the Lighthouse, which is a project of Incarnation with St. Paul's. And we had given them some prep material beforehand, but this is an important question about discernment of us. Given the unification of the Church of the Incarnation with St. Paul's, what is planned for the Lighthouse?
So the little bit that I know is that the current asylum seekers in the current rectory are needing a new home when that property is presumably sold. And so I remember when someone who's on the board and part of this process was kind of giving me a heads up about that, the first question I asked her is, aren't there other rectories that aren't being used in this diocese? And she said, yes, probably, and that's possibly what will happen. But in our diocese, we have a rectory of one of our churches that is being used for asylum seekers as well. And in fact, there's a sign, some of you may have one of those green and white and orange signs in your yard that's supportive. The sign that's in the yard of that rectory came from the Slater's house as a gift when they opened those doors last year.
Thank you. What ideas do you have to make the work of the diocese a reality to the local parish?
So I'm going to rephrase that question a little bit because whenever I hear the word parish, it sort of raises a flag. I like to use the term congregations because that's more broadly reflective of different communities. And so one of the most important values for me in my current diocesan work is helping congregations engage with their local communities, which means in many ways pragmatically like just knowing who's in their community. So if there's a business across the street from the church property, who runs the business? Is there a relationship with that individual? What do the people in the congregation know about the community? Have the people in the congregation ever walked the community? Those are important relationship building things because, as I said earlier, if we can't engage with the community, then what's the purpose of coming to church? We don't just come there to be fed. We come to be fed so that we are nourished to go do something else.
Thank you. What would be your approach in helping struggling churches, and if need be, making the tough choice to close? So that sounds like struggling financially.
It could mean,
Or
it can mean, yes, again, without the context of the question, I could imagine, I think a lot of us think of struggling as meaning financial. That's not true in many cases. Diocese of Maryland, I've been a part of closing a number of churches and part of my role. That's one of the most painful things anybody has to do. But sustainability and vitality aren't just about finances. A lot of it's about leadership. So some churches may have the financial sustainability, but they lack the leadership sustainability. Those are two both very distinct and important factors. So an assessment tool we've just started using in our diocese that's actually being beta tested for our denomination looks at a variety of those sustainability and vitality measurements, and those are two different things as well. So that if a congregation has leadership capacity but lacks financial sustainability, there's a different strategy for helping them than one that has kind of the opposite problem. So, and again, I think a lot of us, when I hear struggling congregations, a lot of us think small congregations. And some of the questions we previously had have kind of tagged those two things together. And I hate hearing the word small attached to the word struggling, because that denigrates the smaller congregations, and I say smaller, not small, that often are much more resilient and creative because of the dynamics of their size and their resources. So a large congregation can be struggling to get people to pledge because they're too dependent on their endowment. So there's lots of different ways you can define struggling. Each parish is unique. Each congregation is unique.
So to go a little deeper, what are some of the methods you have deployed to strengthen parishes?
So I just mentioned the assessment tool. That's still fairly new to us. The way we're using that currently, because as part of my role, I was not in charge of congregational development until our congregational development person retired earlier this year. And so I took that on with some kind of creative reworking of my time. And so basically what I do is I'm training a cohort of congregational consultants, many of whom are clergy, but some of whom are lay people with some expertise in that area. And we're doing we've just done our second kind of peer group training, and I've already deployed 2 of them as a team to go out and work with one of our congregations. They're using this assessment tool that I've offered and mentioned already. We also have some other professional consultants that we sometimes bring in depending on the particular situation. A lot of times it isn't just about bringing in a toolkit of survival techniques like the newest way to bring in supplemental income to supplement the parishioner income. Those are tools. Sometimes it's really just working with the leadership that's in place then and there to develop good normative behavior about what it means to be church and what it means to be a team of leadership. If the leadership isn't there, and it doesn't necessarily have to involve clergy leadership. There are plenty of congregations in our history as an Episcopal church that were never clergy dependent because there weren't that many clergy around in the early days. And so empowering lay people, raising up all sorts of ordained leadership, so not just priests for full-time ministry, but priests for part-time ministry or vocational ministry, empowering and equipping and making more accessible the doorway into the diaconate. Those are all pieces of the puzzle that need to be equally made available to people in the diocese.
I know we opened with a question about our youth and their voices. So this question follows not only in that way, but even as we go into further into the issues around gun violence. So the question is, what is next in addressing gun violence?
That's an intriguing question. I can only speak from my experience in the Diocese of Maryland. Obviously, you know it's a passion of mine. Our diocese, as I mentioned, is next week, and one of our 4 resolutions is about gun violence and pushing a resolution on toward General Convention this summer. One of the things we have done around gun violence, and this is continuing, is to get people with differing perspectives to talk to each other. And so in our diocese, that means people in Western Maryland for whom guns are equated with hunting, to talk to people from West Baltimore for whom guns are equated with gang violence and retaliation. Very different perspectives. And to educate both sides of how different those issues are, so that people in both Western Maryland and West Baltimore both understand that the predominance of gun violence outside of urban areas is suicide. A lot of people don't realize that. There's a much larger volume of gun violence by method of suicide than a lot of people are aware of. So it's not just about urban gun violence. It's about the use of guns, the access to guns, the regulation of guns, how we understand those in different contexts that we all need to hear each other talk about as we continue to move forward with looking at continued legislation that allows the majority of us to own what I think we believe is the most appropriate use of gun control.
Thank you. Move into a little theology. How would you define heresy? Heresy.
Heresy. Well, I guess whatever I say could be considered heretical. So disclaimer right off the bat, systematic theology was not my strongest subject. It's a little bit better than church history, but when you go to a seminary that teaches systematic theology after lunch, not a great time. So I'm also trying not to read too much of the history of a previous bishop into that question, but it's hard not to. So when I think back to some of the great forebears in the church, some of the great champions in the church, I'm aware that many of them were labeled as heretics. And that they were brave enough and courageous enough to push through that label as well as anything else that prevented them from speaking their truth in their day and age, to then do what they felt called to do. So when I hear myself saying that, I hope that means that whatever voice I find for myself, whether it's in the Diocese of Newark or in the Diocese of Maryland or wherever I keep ending up in my ministry, that I can trust my voice and my integrity as a child of God, and trust my relationship with God to help me speak more than the way I think people are expecting me to speak.
Okay, this question, and these are the ones from the floor that we're listening to now. Given that the church is in transition, what do you believe is the next step that the church needs to take into the future? And define how you want to use church.
Right. So whenever I hear a question like that, I define church with a capital C, which means the broad church. I'm aware that we just celebrated the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. We were in very close relationship with the Lutherans in Baltimore, so we actually got to plant some of their 500 trees in their synod on our church properties. I'm also aware, I've heard that there's a dynamic in culture that there's a cyclical change that can often happen every 500 years or so. And that you can point to things in the life of the church that mark that. And so if that's true, and we know that we're at that cyclical mark right now, and we all know that outside of the church there's lots of other things happening in society. Just the digital change in communication is a huge tectonic shift culturally. And so my sense is that one of the sweet spots of opportunity, and one of the other candidates already said this, is the church has a unique opportunity right now, in this day and age, that it may lose if we don't live into it, to be a unique voice as this shift happens, not just within our own lives, but in our lives beyond ourselves. And I think that voice is a prophetic voice about how do we talk to each other without having to worry so much about being either polarized or unified. An earlier question in the session was like, how would I help unify the diocese, or how would I help unify the world? And I'm like, I don't think it's realistic to try to unify anybody. But when we can bring people with differing opinions together and find out what we have in common, that we can then walk hand in hand towards something, that's a better use of our energy than just standing and looking at each other and fighting.
Thank you. And this goes along with that then. What do you see as the first priority of the Bishop of Newark, and why?
My first priority would be to listen. I think that sounds almost simplistic, but as someone who is, for those of you familiar with the Enneagram, I'm a 5, which means I'm an investigator, which means I have to pull in information before I can really engage in whatever the issue is. And so I would personally need to do a lot of information gathering. For me to get that information, it would not just be getting statistics off of your website, which I've already done, big surprise, but to have conversations with people, and especially conversations with people in different settings. So clergy and laity, priests and deacons, female clergy and male clergy, female laity, male laity, people of color, people like me, a variety of different perspectives, people from the western part of the diocese, people from urban settings, people from suburban settings. You know, every church is unique, just as each of us are individually unique. And so to spend a lot of time listening, especially the first year, and yet not, if there are urgent things that needed attention, not listening to death, because we can't afford to listen to death, because we don't want to die. So figuring out that balance would be important, but still doing a lot of listening, because you need to get to know me to trust me, and I need to get to know you before I can trust you as well.
This is a leadership question. The work of the bishop requires the support of both staff and volunteers. How would you create a positive work environment for them?
Yeah, without knowing the particulars of the individuals, although Greg Jacobs is a colleague of mine, so I do know Greg fairly well. But I imagine what I would do is what I did in the Diocese of Maryland when I started on the staff 8 years ago. And there was a lot of, I'm hesitant to say dysfunction on the staff, but there was not a lot of collegial team ethos amongst our staff at the time. And so we did some intentional team building. We function, I think, pretty well from my limited perspective as the supervisor of a lot of the staff, as colleagues. And so the person at the front desk has as much voice and as much appreciation by the rest of us as the bishops. We also, I will say, sadly, were cohesively brought together a lot more in the wake of the Heather Cook tragedy for us. Our pension fund was very generous in providing trauma therapists to come in to meet with us, both as a group and as individuals as need be. That was a really helpful thing because it personalized us with each other. One of the really important things we do at staff meetings every week is we go, we're a staff of about 25 when you include cathedral members and some other folks on the edges. We're going to go around the room once saying, if I need to report on an event coming up, just kind of need to know things, we do that. And then we go around the room a second time doing personal things just to check in. So, I want to let you all know I had a great time last weekend seeing my grandchild. Or great movie that I just saw. You all should go see Black Panther. It's awesome. Something like that. It can be any kind of subject, but it personalizes all of us. And so during football season, it's always interesting to see because we have a lot of teams represented, including the Jets up until a couple of years ago. So it's always intriguing to see how people's faces are either happy or sad depending on what happened a couple of days earlier.
Thank you. Another leadership question. How would you deal with conflict with clergy, so bishop to clergy? And then the second part with laity, and that would be the clergy and the laity within a congregation.
Right, they're very different things. So clergy and laity, I've had a lot more experience with because of my particular role. One of the jokes that many of us who are canons to the ordinary make is that bishops carry croziers, but canons to the ordinary carry shovels. So that's actually, I mean, it sounds sad, but it's a gift to be able to go in and help clean things up when things get messy. And so I've had a number of opportunities to work with particularly leadership in congregations because most conflict arises around the relationship of the priest with a couple of vestry members. That's usually where the conflict is most common. And what most often happens in that type of a situation is the rest of the vestry becomes passive and they lose their voice. So a lot of the norm building that I do in those situations, which sometimes takes months and numerous vestry meetings to accomplish, is to help make sure all three of those voices are represented equally in the room. And to be able to name the culpability of the rector, the culpability of some of those, and I'll call them bullies, which is one of the terms we often use when sheep attack, and to call them out appropriately on their behavior and hold them accountable to those norms, and to hold the passive voices in the vestry meetings accountable for speaking out and not allowing that behavior to continue to happen. Those are all three important dynamics. Bishop to clergy, that's a tough one because the bishop is supposed to be the pastor to the clergy, but the bishop's also in charge of the clergy. And so it's a conflict of interest. So one of the ways we do that in our diocese, the way I observe our bishops doing that, is we have a chaplain to the clergy who does not answer to the bishop. She's a retired clergy person herself. She is the pastoral go-to person for clergy for many reasons. And that gives the bishop a little more distance to come in a different way. And it gives clergy a lot more freedom to talk to her than they might have coming to talk to the bishop. Because anytime a clergy person comes to the bishop's office, other than to plan a pre-visitation Sunday visit, it feels like going into the principal's office. And bishops are very aware of that. So for bishops, balancing that sense of compassion and justice in the way clergy are treated is really tricky. But they're both important because the bishop has a responsibility not just to the congregations under the bishop's charge, but also to be a pastoral support to the clergy that serve those congregations. And sometimes the bishop can't do both very well at the same time without figuring out that balance.
Thank you. As bishop, what would you do to raise up young people of color to be priests and deacons?
I'd love the opportunity to help figure out how to do that. Just raising up younger people for ordination in all orders would be wonderful. I think it's especially important during Sunday visits, and again, part of my role has been to visit churches in our diocese as part of the rotation of the bishops, so I've been to every church in the Diocese of Maryland at least once. So when we do those visits, we often get to know people in those parishes, and so I think a good bishop or a good canon of the ordinary, anybody who's visiting a church on a Sunday, needs to keep their eye peeled for potential leaders. Not just asking the leaders in those congregations, who would you raise up? But just listening and paying attention. So we have someone in one of our historically African-American churches who is transgender. And I was there celebrating their Easter Vigil a couple of years ago. And he read the Ezekiel lesson. And as I was hearing him read the lesson, I thought, wow, what a voice he has. He needs to be a preacher. And then I learned subsequently he was already toying with being in the process, and he's still in discernment. He's still got a lot of hurdles to get through, not just our own hurdles, but some of his own personal hurdles. But just having that sort of ear to the ground to listen for leadership, because sometimes those people are not going to come forward for lots of reasons, including barriers we put in front of them. So we need to be proactively looking for people, not just people of color, but anybody who is underrepresented in leadership in the church. So that could also mean people for the diaconate. My perception in this diocese, there are not as many women priests in charge of congregations as I would have expected looking through your clergy directory. And that surprises me and intrigues me as to why that is. So that's an observation.
Thank you. How do the people at the Diocese of Maryland feel about the potential of losing you to the Diocese of Newark?
Well, I can't speak for them, but I can share with you some of the comments they've been making. My bishop being first and foremost, at least 3 times he has said to me, including last week before we parted ways to come up here, first words out of his mouth, and he and I have known each other a long time, 20 years. We used to serve as associates at St. Columba's together. So he said, Scott, I really want you to get this. He said, I really want you to be in the House of Bishops with me. But I would really be disappointed if you leave. So I get that. I really hear that with the voice of love. And so as various friends of ours, and Becky has her own friends, some of whom are not even Episcopalians, have kind of responded to us. I know. Nor have any desire to be. Have said to us, we really feel ambivalent about this. I mean, part of us really wants this for you. Well, part of us wants to see this part of your life affirmed, but selfishly, a lot of us really don't want to see it happen. So, it's causing anxiety. I mean, we've just lost 2 other diocesan staff members who are clergy, and I'm sort of holding the fort together along with the 2 bishops, and I know the diocese is nervous about that. So we're gonna be trolling people at General Convention this summer, just in case.
This has to do with Latino and Hispanic ministry and what your thoughts or plans may be for this diocese.
I'm certainly aware that you have a lot of Latinos, and I tend to use the term Latino because I'm not aware that we need to do a lot of work for people from Spain. We may need to do some work with some people from Brazil or from Latino communities that don't necessarily speak Spanish. But there's certainly a lot of opportunities to bring in people who speak Spanish from Latino countries. And I know that there are 2 primary ways that the Episcopal Church focuses on doing that. One is to welcome immigrants or first-generation Latinos into our churches, or to create environments in which there can be Spanish language liturgies. We have one of those churches in our diocese that is just for Latinos, although they just started an English language service for the 2nd generations of that community that are now wanting that. I'm also aware, though, that an underrepresented reach in our community is to 2nd and 3rd generation Latinos, many of whom already worship in our churches, or many of whom would probably love to come to our churches because they've been marginalized either as Roman Catholics or, more often than not now, a Pentecostal or evangelical tradition, and are not feeling welcome in those traditions either because they're openly gay or lesbian, or because they're divorced, or because they've had some other reason to not be present in that community and feel fully included. And so that's a ripe opportunity to bring people into our fold. But that's a different way to do it than just creating another Spanish language liturgy somewhere and hoping people will come. So both of those are very important. And I've learned a lot by supervising our own Latina missioner in our diocese. And so she's pretty knowledgeable of what goes on in the Latino community within not just her own community, but also in our denominational level.
Cute.
And I got to preach, I didn't preach there. I got to celebrate there on Easter, which was phenomenal. She preached.
So say a little bit about how you think, how you see lay ministry in our diocese.
The most important ministry in this diocese is going to be done by the laity, because for those of you in the room who are lay people, you make up the vast majority of the people in this diocese. So to be able to equip you, to empower you, to make sure that you all not only have the training and resources that you need, but to nudge you into ministries that you may not think you're capable of doing. The first vice president of our diocesan council, who is by our canon required to be a layperson, our current first vice president was one of my references for this process, and she is now beginning the discernment process for the diaconate. And she said that one of the reasons she is open to being in that discernment process is because I nudged her as a member of diocesan council a couple of years ago to be willing to serve as their first vice president. So sometimes people don't think they have the skills or the leadership that others of us see in them first and need to tell them and nudge them into. And so certainly for a lot of us who are ordained ministers in this church, that's a lot of our job, is to not do the work of the laity, but to empower the laity to do their work and stand behind them and nudge them and encourage them and keep pushing y'all to keep doing what you need to do and getting out of your way.
You brought up the diaconate in your last comment. Can you say a little bit more about what your ideas for the diaconate are in this diocese, as far as training and their
Yes.
work and function within the world?
First thing I want to say is I'm an Episcopalian because I grew up across the street from a deacon whose daughter was in high school with me, a family that welcomed me into their home when things would get tough in my house, and a family that invited me to go to church with them one Sunday when I was 17 years old. That's the reason I'm an Episcopalian. And I had the great joy about 10 years ago of interring Henry Marsh in the cemetery at St. Paul's Patterson, which is where his family grew up. That's sort of my first connection with this diocese. So I'm very passionate from a very personal, selfish perspective about the diaconate. One of the things I've enjoyed seeing in our diocese in the last 2 years with the leadership of Bishop Knudsen, our assistant bishop, is we have reformed the way we not only recruit deacons, but the way we form them. And so for recruitment, we've opened the door. Rather than having a single door to enter the process, we've provided multiple doors so that you don't have to, it's not a one-size-fit-all discernment process. And so especially for people who work full-time, who may not work the hours when they're available to do clinical pastoral education, we now have a variety of ways that people can go through the formation process to be able to achieve the objectives of being able to function in that role. And so we now have currently 20 people in our diocese in formation for the diaconate, and 10 more starting this year. That's huge, because we don't even have 20 functioning deacons right now that are otherwise not retired. And so that's because we've made the process more nimble and adaptable and accessible for those people. I'd love to have the opportunity to do that here.
What is the bishop's role in making the teachings of the church relevant to young people, for younger people?
Thank you. Audrey's been listening to me. So again, I hate terms that label people like that. So you can label younger any way you want, but the way I read that question is people in younger generations, which could mean teenagers, it could mean people in their 30s, who are not part of the generation of most of us in this room. And so I think for a lot of us, myself as a boomer, and a lot of us in the church right now would be in that category, we have to start expecting people who are not boomers to do things the way we think they need to be done, or the way they've always been done. Easier said than done. But again, when we allow younger people to be in leadership, they then teach us what their gifts are and what we can learn from them. March for Our Lives is a classic example. Those Parkland students are teaching us how to be vocal advocates in the world today. So we just need to continue to find ways, multiple ways to give them voice and allow them to live into their own leadership skills that are already innately in them, rather than us feeling like we have to teach them how to be leaders. They got a lot to teach us.
Now for something fun.
Excellent.
Tell us about something that you love or love to do outside of your family and your friends.
Looking at my wife, this is a toughie. Probably the one that comes to mind, because you'll hear the theme of walking always going on. I love to hike, and I grew up going to national parks as a child, and so anytime I can go on a really challenging, amazing hike in some amazing place, I'll go do it, even if I don't have a family member that'll do it with me. And so when our last vacation was in September, my wife Becky's mother had a couple of bucket list trip items that we wanted to help her fulfill. And so we went to California in September and went to Yosemite, where she had never been, and drove the California coast. And so when we were in Carmel, where we got to stay for 3 nights, which was amazing, I did a lot of hiking in the morning before either of them were even thinking about getting up. Because I love to hike first thing in the morning, be the first one on the trail. So, and hiking for me doesn't mean having to be in a national park. I did a 3-mile walk around our hotel this morning, exploring 2 different college campuses, one of which had the word Elizabeth in it. That's like, I remember. There you go. Yep.
Okay. Is there something else you'd like to share or tell us in these last few moments?
I'm going to use one of the questions from this morning. One of the questions was, what am I currently reading? And so what I said first off is that I'm not a strong reader. That's one of those shame issues I've had to work on in my own life, thinking that all priests have to be good readers and enjoy reading the current work on Origin of Alexandria. That's not going to happen with me, unless I have to write a paper on it. So I love reading the Washington Post. That's sort of my go-to. I didn't get around to reading Thursday's comics until last night because I didn't have time to. Or finishing the puzzles, which is a very important thing. So most of my reading is the Washington Post right now. The book that's sitting on my bedside table that I've been slowly picking my way through because I'm usually too tired at night to read is Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Beautiful Struggle. And I actually read his other book first, so I'm sort of reading them in reverse chronological order. He's an author from Baltimore, and has done a lot of work on reparations. The book before that was Braving the Wilderness by Brené Brown, because I'm one of her groupies. And then probably one of my favorite authors who is both sort of a churchy person, but also just a fun person to read, is Anne Lamott. You know, and Becky and I had the opportunity to meet her at a conference for Episcopalians in recovery, so that was really wonderful. She speaks just like she writes. No holds barred.
Thank you. Thank you. Carlye, we note that you would be coming to us from one of the more conservative dioceses of the Episcopal Church, particularly with regard to the ministry of women. Would you please speak to us about your experience as a woman clergy in that diocese and how that might inform your ministry among us in the Diocese of Newark?
So first I need to talk about the fact that Fort Worth, the Diocese of Fort Worth in the Episcopal Church, is a progressive diocese that calls women and all people who feel called to ministry. All manner of folk are welcome in our churches. There was a time previous to November of 2008 where you could have called Fort Worth one of the most conservative dioceses in the Episcopal Church. But in November of 2008, the bishop at convention invited the diocese to make a decision about whether the diocese stayed in the Episcopal Church or left. They chose to leave. Eventually became affiliated with the American Church, Anglican Church in North America, and they continue on. So there are 2 entities in Fort Worth, both operating as the Episcopal Church, or the Episcopal Diocese of Fort Worth. The one that I am a part of and the Trinity is a part of is in the Episcopal Church. The things that are important for you to know about in terms of my experience and why I'm taking a little longer with this question, because I think it honors the people I'm in ministry with and honors the work that they have done. This is a group of Episcopalians who have done something that very few Episcopalians get the opportunity to do, and that is defend the faith. That's not something we give Sunday school classes in, or that we lead adult forums on how to defend the faith. They kind of had to learn that in the throes of crisis, and that is something they have done. They have stood the ground for the Episcopal Church, planted the Episcopal flag, and are proud bearers of our Anglican tradition. They called me to Fort Worth, not because I'm a woman, but they were delighted to call a woman to be rector of the church. They called me to Fort Worth because of the specific gifts that I bring. They wanted somebody that could help them work through change. They knew they were in a completely new world. Their previous rector was at retirement, and he brought them through the split in the diocese and brought them through that virtually intact. There were some people that left, but the majority of the church wanted to stay. So he had earned his right to retirement. Yes. And so they wanted somebody that would bring them into the world of the Episcopal Church and also into the size that they were. They were a very healthy size congregation, acting like they were 50 to 75 people on a Sunday morning, that they were a small church in a small town. It's a robust program-sized church in a city of 1 million people. It's been a long time since Fort Worth is a small town. It likes to feel like it's a small town, but that is not what it is. In terms of my particular call, I am not the first woman called to lead a congregation in the Episcopal Diocese, but I am the only woman leading a congregation in any denomination of that size in the city of Fort Worth. So it's something that people are still trying to work out, not in my congregation, but in the wider world, still trying to work out, what do we think about that? What do we do with that? Yeah, I just go about my business. 6 years later, people are still trying to figure it out, and sometimes we get to figure that out together. What it has done for me to be in ministry in Fort Worth and with this congregation is it has made me bold. It has given me a sense of confidence about who I am, not only as a woman leading a congregation, but an African-American woman leading a congregation. My congregation is predominantly white, but it has drawn more people of color in most of its services since having a person of color in the front of the room. I am extremely comfortable in my own skin and talking about things that are complex and complicated going on in the world, going on in our church, going on in our surrounding community. We've got folks that have said to me, after I say to them from time to time that I worry about how hard I push them, and their response is, "You're not pushing us anywhere we did not want to go in the first place." So I'm really proud of that group of people. I'm proud of the stance they took. I'm proud of the support that they gave me. And I can't fully describe how proud they are of me. There are people who still to this day, every now and again, it'll be a Sunday where the associate rector, who is male, will be off, and you'll have 2 women priests and a female deacon up there, and people are crying in the congregation because that is something they thought they would never see in Fort Worth, Texas. And here we all are in Fort Worth, Texas, doing exactly that. And as someone in my congregation said to me, we thought you would be here forever and ever, amen, but this is what we were fighting for. We wanted to be full members of the Episcopal Church, and for you, from Fort Worth, Texas, to be standing on a slate in the Diocese of Newark. Can we get the full irony there? They are so proud they do not know what to do with themselves. I've gotten messages from them the entire time I've been here. So I'm proud of them. I feel honored to be their leader. And I think that they have helped make me stronger and better and bigger at what I do.
Thank you. You have talked in other sessions a little bit about your experiences growing up in a church. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, and thank you for asking me that. I love getting to talk about the way I grew up, and I wish everybody had that. And I love congregations when they figure out how to give this to children. Part of this was the time that I grew up, but everybody in my church, and it was a small church, everybody in my church knew who I was, and I knew who everybody else was. And I was a very precocious, very spiritual child. So when I walked into the rector's office and said at 13, we don't have Sunday school, I want to start one. He said, well, let's talk about how we make that happen. And I became the Sunday school teacher, and then we had a Sunday school program, and parents would sometimes remind their children as their children went home and said, well, Carlye said today, and Carlye says this, and Carlye says we have to do that. They would remind their children that Carlye is not Jesus. You must still do what your mother says. But it was a place where I was so supported in my spiritual life and always encouraged to be the faithful person. And when I said something faithful, people took that seriously. It was not adults talking down to a child. It was adults cherishing the spiritual life of a child. And probably one of the happiest moments for me was the ladies who helped support me in Sunday school activity have been at my ordinations, they were at my weddings. One of them has since died. But whenever I speak in Fort Worth, the one who's still with us, she's always there. So that makes you feel beloved. That's how I learned who God was. And that's how I learned I was God's beloved daughter from that group of people. That's a gift we can give to kids. It really and truly is. Because kids come to us with a spiritual life. Our job is to just continue to fan those flames.
Can you say a little bit more about fanning those flames? The question is, what's the bishop's role in making the teaching of the church relevant to younger people?
There's a couple of things that kind of come together on this question. I've heard it before, which is, it's what's the bishop's role and what's the bishop's staff role in resourcing congregations. That's what I hear when I hear the conversation. And then what's the role of churches and what kind of help do churches need in terms of young folks. The reality is that the schedules of schools and teams and things that might get kids into college run the household. Those are the facts. I wish it were different. I tell parents all the time, you actually are the head of the household. You have some choice in this. But they're convinced that the things they're doing are vital. So part of my job, I finally decided, and I think as bishop is the same, is I go younger. I start out as much as we can encouraging people with infants to think about the spiritual life and how they are going to nurture the spiritual life. So those infants and their parents are in your congregations. As bishop, I'm not going to have that kind of access, but certainly bishop and staff can resource you if that's the kind of thing where you're thinking, I'm not exactly sure what to do about that, but that sounds like a good idea. That's the kind of thing that we can do teaching around or partner up and help people think their way through. I've got my church is on retreat this weekend, and there are 4 little boys that think, because this is their 4th retreat, they're 6, 7, and 8 years old, they think they're supposed to go on retreat every year. Win for the church. Big win for the church, but it meant starting young. And my goal is that stays with them for as long as we can get it to. We want to protect that time that they're still in the household as long as we have them. There's enough that's going to work against their spiritual life when they leave us. But while they're with us, we want to kind of start that pipeline that we keep building on.
Thank you. This is youth, but in a slightly different vein. With youth becoming more vocal around issues such as guns, equality, and the environment, how would you support and lift up those voices?
By doing exactly that, by supporting them and lifting them up, by talking about it, making sure that people know what they're doing, by joining them if available to join them. So when youth were marching in our city, every clergy person, including the bishop, was there. Everybody showed up. And they were all the speakers, and we were there to support them. So it meant reordering schedules for almost all of us. But we reordered those schedules. We wanted them to know that they had our support and that what they were doing was important. So it just means for me, it means making that a priority. And then also to share that information out so people know that it's a priority.
Thank you. Part of the life of the church is the role of the deacon, and the question is around how do you see deacons acting in our congregations, the training, ordination, what their work and support might be?
So I've always had a healthy respect for deacons. The great love I have for deacons comes from going 4 years without a deacon. Then one went by, and like, Victor dance! And she's wonderful. She is just terrific at what she does. As parish priest, there are things that I think would be just as important to me as potentially as bishop. And that is the way deacons see the world. I always say they look at the world sideways. They see things that we're not looking at. And in particular, they see things I'm not looking at because I'm looking at the horizon. I'm looking as far out as I can see, and I'm looking at the biggest of picture. And sometimes, this building is a perfect example. I'm looking at what's down that way, and there's all these little half steps. And if you're not looking down, you don't know that they're there. And deacons, it's not just that they tell you about the half step, but they tell you about the person who's living under that half step that you might not even see. So as a parish priest, it's helpful to have someone who's calling our attention to people on the margins. When I think of being a bishop and having multiple deacons sitting around the table talking about what is going on in this geographic area and the entire diocese, that just sounds fantastic. These are people who've got their ear to the ground, their finger on the pulse, that can really tell us where needs are. And that's a powerful resource. I know you have training for deacons already in place. I have not heard anyone questioning the efficacy of that training. It's certainly something I would want to review and take a look at. But it's not, I'm not the kind of person who walks into a place thinking, how many things can I change today? My goal when I walk into a place is I want to see that place do its thing. So if I were the bishop here, I would want to see the Diocese of Newark be the Diocese of Newark. I want to get through a full liturgical year. I want to see everything the diocese does and how it does it. The one caveat to that is if there's something that's dangerous going on, that's stuff I address immediately. Those are safety issues, and that's different. But I think it takes time to get a sense of where things are. So I think, and training for deacons, I think, is important. So I'm not one that's just going, oh, let's just change it.
Thank you. The work of a bishop requires the support of both staff and volunteers. How would you create a positive work environment for them?
I think that's another place to work on relationship and community. And then for me, there's also that human resources and leadership development piece. There are, first of all, to be a person who is present and people know that you are present is how you're in relationship with staff. and volunteers, so that there are specific times that people know I'm around and that they have access. That's a very important thing. I would rather have people feel comfortable with telling me when something is going wrong rather than letting me find out when it is going wrong. So people have got to know that I don't blow up when I hear about things that are going wrong. So it's about showing people a consistency level that way. It means building in feedback loops so that people can know how they're doing and people can tell me how they're doing with things. And then there's kind of those basics of succession planning and professional development and identifying people for specific projects that would help them grow into their ministry or take it to the next level, whether they're on staff or volunteering. People feel that urge and that need for things to deepen or expand or grow. So all of that helps to create an environment, I think, where people are respected and valued. And it takes that multiple layering of steps so that people do feel that they're important and that their time is important and that I value their time.
Thank you. Going a little bit more into relations, how would you deal with conflict with clergy, so bishop to clergy, and then with laity with clergy in a congregation?
Okay, so in some ways, all right, let me address this first. I know you have some process already in place for dealing with conflict. So I'm not talking about changing process. So what I'd like to talk about instead is my philosophy towards dealing with conflict. For me, it's important that people know who I am, so I tell the truth. And that they know where I stand, so I tell them where I stand. It's also important that they know my word is important to me, and that when I give my word, I stick to it. And when I think those things put me in a place of integrity in terms of relationship. And when you're working with integrity, it can make doing the work of conflict not necessarily easier, but people are more willing to enter into those conversations with someone that they trust, that they know is telling the truth, that is transparent, that is present, and whose word actually matters. There's nothing like that horrible feeling of the person who talks to 5 people and each of the 5 people thinks that they have gotten the answer. And it's the last person in front of them. Every single person got what they wanted to hear, not necessarily the answer. It's a terrible way to live. That's not who I am as leader. When there's a decision, the decision is made, I communicate that decision. I talked with people, including clergy, about difficult things all the time. I have told clergy, I've just said right out, I don't know who I thought I was. If I were your bishop, I would put you on suspension right now. You will stop what you're doing, and if you don't stop it immediately, I will inform the bishop. But somebody needs to say the words sometime, because people need to know when they have crossed the line. And usually when I'm that hard and harsh, people have crossed the line that can do harm to somebody. So sometimes you have to say the difficult thing so that people know exactly where they stand. Sometimes conflict also takes people knowing that they're loved. And that the resolution might not be exactly what they want it to be, but if they're respected and honored and loved throughout every piece of that conflict conversation, that sometimes people can live with that. You know, I was in a situation with a hire that just was not working, and I said to this person who was brilliant, fantastic, would love to have them on staff, but it was the wrong time in their life and the wrong job for them to be doing. And I just said, why are you so unhappy in your job here? And they burst into tears and cried for an hour and told me everything. And I said, why don't you take some time to think and see if this really is the job you want? And we were able to work out something. It wasn't the job they wanted. They were afraid of finances. We figured figured out something that could work so that they could leave their job with some more dignity and a little bit of security.
In an age of #MeToo and #Black Lives Matter, you represent the intersectionality of both place and gender. How has that played out in your ministry, and how do you anticipate it playing out if you were elected bishop?
When I went to Fort Worth, one of the things they asked me is, how are you going to handle this, being an African-American woman leading this congregation? And I said, I've been handling that my whole life. The question is, how are you going to handle it? And I would say that would be the same in the Diocese of Newark. The question is, how are other people going to handle it? I handle how people handle it all the time. I am a black woman in the United States. So I deal with this all the time. And I maintain great relationships with all kinds of folks who are trying to figure out. I know sometimes people haven't dealt with a black woman as an authority figure, much less the one leading an organization. And the first time that happened, and so everything is whirling in their brain. Because they're like, okay, right, I know this is good, but what do I do? So it takes, on my part, it takes a willingness to be with people exactly where they are. It takes also, there are times where I encourage people to do a little bit of reading so that we can get on the same page about some things. And I'm willing to have honest conversations with people. I don't need to blast people out of the water for where they are. And if they have conversations, and I feel like the time we live in is a time of great learning also, if we are willing to be teachers. That's the big if we're willing to be teachers. And I'm willing to be one of those.
Thank you. This is a question about open table for communion. We know what the Canon states. What is your thought about congregations in this diocese that offer an open table?
Right. So, the thing that I said before, that I want to see the diocese be the diocese, my hope is that when I visit churches, they do what they do. I would hate for somebody to go, the bishop's coming, let's not do this right now. I want to see what people do. I really and truly do. I am not prescriptive when it comes to liturgy. I think there's a wideness in the Episcopal Church. I know there's a wideness of practice in the Diocese of Newark. I'm curious to see what people do. In terms of open table specifically, if there are folks who are practicing open table, one of my expectations is that there is abundant teaching about communion, and that doesn't happen just once a year, that it's embedded in preaching, that it's embedded in teaching, that it's embedded in the bulletin. And if there are restrictions on when people receive communion, so if you must be baptized or you must be of a certain age, etc., that again, same thing, that it's embedded in preaching and teaching in the bulletin so that people get a chance to learn about whatever it is that they are doing. To me, that is the most important issue. And I find that we typically, in the Episcopal Church, though we have a wide variety of alternative liturgies available to us, supplemental materials, we tend to be pretty stuck on page 323 and 355 of the Book of Common. And there's some opportunity to do some growing. I always throw this out there. We actually have a service for quinceañeras in the Episcopal Church. That's in our alternative materials. So it's worth it to just make sure we know our resources.
Thank you. Given that the church is in transition, what do you believe is the next step the church needs to take into the future?
I think for the whole church, including for this diocese, and including for the individual congregation, we need to be doing more of what we're doing. That we need to make sure we're doing more ministry that creates loving community outside of the community in inside the church, that we're creating those communities beyond the church doors, that we need to find ways to use our language that is full of love and full of blessing everywhere we possibly can, that we tell our story. I would hope that that people would share the words of their priests that they hear in sermons on social media. That it's rare for us, do you know how much social media is negative? I mean, when you look at your feeds, you see how much yelling at people there is. Imagine in there, every once in a while, a nugget that you hear from a sermon being in the feed. I would hope that we would find more ways, and we must find more ways to invite people into our communities, to make our borders porous, so that people can get a sense of God's love and mercy within the context of relationship. So I think those are some starting places, but all of them sound like things that you're doing already, that you have done in the past, and that we need to keep doing with added zeal, with more energy, and continued enthusiasm.
Thank you. As bishop, what would you do to raise up young people of color to be priests and deacons?
Ask them. No, seriously, it's the thing that we don't do. We ask them. And what you're dealing with, particularly when you deal with college or people of color who are college tracked, is that you are dealing with parents who look at the potential non-return on investment for going to seminary, and they go, oh no, you're not going to do that. So you're kind of up against a brick wall there, but it takes asking people. I tell you, the Baptists, we have got to follow in their footsteps. I have had more Baptist churches try to recruit me out of the Episcopal Church because they need mature, ordained women that already have a track record. Can you imagine an Episcopalian going up to somebody and saying, have you considered leaving your ordained place and coming into our church? Well, chutzpah. You know, we gotta get some. But you know, there was a young Latino man sitting in my office. We were talking about something else when we all got done. I said, I know this is going to sound crazy, but have you ever considered going to seminary and getting ordained? And his eyes filled up with tears. He's 30 years old. His eyes filled up with tears, and he said, I actually talked to my mom about that when I was ordained, and she said no. And told me I couldn't do it. And he said, it's always been there. This guy has priest tattooed across his forehead. But it took asking, because he seems perfectly happy in his life. So it really, that ask is important. And that's the work of the community in the church, is people doing the ask.
Okay. How do the people in your congregation feel about the potential of losing you to the Diocese of Newark?
They are of two minds. They routinely send me weather reports from this part of the world. Say, are you sure about this? I have had at least one person say, I cannot pray about that. I'm not praying against it, but I'm not praying for it either. I'm just leaving it where it is. But by and large, this is the proudest group of people because this is what it was about in Fort Worth. This is why they took a stand. And they feel like the fact that I took this step, which, you know, they, on one hand, they wish that I hadn't, but they're so fascinated by it. Fort Worth has not seen an Episcopal election in over 25 years. Do you know how much Episcopal elections have changed in 25 years? We weren't background checking the way we do back then. So it's a whole different world right now. We certainly didn't have women running the way we do now back then. So it's the most exciting thing for them. And they've been sending, as they're on retreat, they've been sending me messages all weekend long.
Well, you deserve a fun question.
Thank you.
Outside of family and friends, what is something that you love or love to do?
I love cookbooks. I can always tell in every room whenever I say it who the cookbook fans are. And I love cookbooks. I love looking through them. For me, a really fun Saturday morning starts with gathering my cookbooks in a particular theme. Lately, the theme has been looking at French cooking. I've never cooked a French meal. I'm not ever going to cook a French meal. But I'll sit and I'll put a whole menu together and I'll look at what Julia Child says and what Ina Garten says, and I have two ladies from Paris and their cookbooks. I'll look at what everybody says and think about what I'm going to cook, make the plan, never do it, and I'm as happy as a clam.
Thank you so much for your time and
Thank you, guys.
The question is, Lisa, one of your statements indicates that you can be very blunt in addressing certain situations. Please speak to us about how that bluntness has been received and how it has both helped or hindered your ministry and how it might enhance your ministry as our bishop.
I think the person that can answer this most candidly is my husband, whom I'd like to introduce to you, Bruce Farrar. One of the deals that we've cut as a family is that I don't introduce or talk about my family in big groups unless we agree to it on the front end. And I thought this would be a more intimate context to be able to introduce him. So I just want to say from the jump that I'm so appreciative of Bruce's journeying with me in this process and for the spiritual depth that he brings and the ballast that he is to my life and my ministry. So the bluntness was probably the word that I threw out because in my experience, my quality of being straightforward can be experienced as being blunt. I want to tell you a story that really informed this for me in my early ministry. I was called when I was about 28 years old to be the rector of St. Anne's in Nashville, Tennessee, which was a struggling parish adjacent to one of the biggest housing projects in Nashville, the James Casey Homes. I was the second woman to be called to be a rector any place in that diocese, and I was one of the youngest priests in the diocese as well. Unbeknownst to me, St. Anne's was 11 months out from being financially bankrupt when I was called to be their rector. And my bishop invited me to go to breakfast with him at Shoney's in our neighborhood. Shoney's is the home of the breakfast buffet. And it's like Frisch's that you might have in the north. In this public place, he said to me over scrambled eggs, "Lisa, why can't you be nice like the other women clergy?" I was stunned and I was so angry. I cried. So, anger for me can come out as tears, or deep feeling for me can come out as tears. I'm not a yeller, so I'm not going to yell at you about anything. I may cry with you through clenched teeth, and I couldn't believe that he was saying that to me. And I was speechless, which is rare for me. So I went home and I thought about what just happened to me. That my bishop would be challenging me to be nice. And what was it about these other women that he was extolling? And what I realized was those women were over 20 years older than I was. They were working at whatever job they could get, and I think at least two of them were working for no pay. They were not in executive positions where they were having to raise money or create a budget. They weren't firing or hiring anyone. And I also realized, as I reflected on that, this bishop had set a marginalized group within his diocese against itself. I learned from that I will never do that as a priest, and I will not do that as a bishop. I also learned that I was pretty much on my own to figure out what was going to happen in my parish and how I was going to address it. and that together we would figure it out or we would not. From that experience, that straightforwardness meant that I had to work through with my vestry the reality that they had denied about their financial situation. At the time, they could not see where they were financially. And anyone who would raise questions at the vestry table about finances was accused of being faithless, of being Dr. No. There was a guy on the vestry who was a lawyer, and he was called Dr. No in jest, but really they meant it. So I knew this group was not going to be able to address their situation in a straightforward manner. And I also knew the truth that we must address this situation. So my way around that was to create an advisory group that they baptized and blessed to go forward and look at the financial situation and to come back to the table with an analysis and recommendations of how to move forward. That was an example, I think, of where my bluntness was very effective with them. St. Anne's is now a thriving congregation in an area of Nashville that is growing in large part because of the ministry that we did together in the East Nashville community. A place where my bluntness does not work very well, either pastorally or systemically, is when denial has set in a person's heart or perspective as a coping mechanism. When people are in denial of their situation, facts don't matter because fear grips the heart and the mind and the imagination. And so as a pastor, which is the way I see my gifts most, I realize that at those times when my forthrightness is scary, when steadfastness and forthrightness feels like bluntness, I've got to be able to step back and allow people permission to not touch where they are until they're ready. And on good days, when I'm in my pastoral place, I'm able to do that effectively. Because what's most important for me is that we can maintain relationship and trust with one another. And I know that people have to choose to engage or not engage. You can't manipulate that and you can't control that. So that's also been part of what I've learned over my 30 years of priesthood.
Thank you. Continuing and going a little bit deeper in this idea of conversations and working through either unspoken secrets or other things in congregations, the work of a bishop requires the support of both staff and volunteers. How would you create a positive work environment for them?
So I think the way you do that with staff and volunteers is I like the way that you create that in the community. I think respecting every person is critical. And the two people that I am most concerned about in my organization, wherever it is, are the people that answer the phone in the door and the people that clean up at the end of the night. The receptionists are the ones that are often vomited on by church people and vendors and by all of those people. And while church people don't think they vomit on others, the experience can often feel like that. So part of what I do as a leader for my staff and volunteers is give them permission to take showers and to step away when they need to. While none of us, I think, goes into the ministry or church work to make big bucks, we all want to make meaning, and we want to have a meaningful difference. So it's important for me to create an environment of trust in my team, where we can tell the truth in love to one another, where differences of opinion are honored and fostered, and where you can feel free to voice your perspective, whether you think I like it or not. I lived under the leadership of someone whom I finally drew the metaphor with the story of the emperor's new clothes. Nobody would tell this leader that he was naked. And I don't want to be that guy. I mean, I don't want to be the guy that's naked and nobody tells me. So, and you don't want that either, right? I have a feeling that would make it into the Star Ledger. So what I want from my staff to say, this is the truth. And that is especially difficult, I would imagine, on a diocesan staff when you are the bishop. It's hard enough to do that when you are the rector. But what I would seek to foster is a climate of trust and respect. And what I can't give in money, I would like to be able to give in flexibility and time.
Thank you. Turning the question just a little bit, how would you deal with conflict with clergy, so bishop to clergy, and then separately with laity and the clergy of a congregation?
So what I would like to propose as part of our working relationship with each other, this has worked effectively in my parish. We recently worked with Eric Law and the Kaleidoscope Institute on a strategic planning process that involved holy currencies. And Eric has a model of respect guidelines that define how we're going to treat each other. So you have to be responsible for yourself and your own opinion and perspective. You have to listen empathetically. You have to be sensitive to the cultural differences that may be in the room around communication styles. R-E-S-P-E. So, where am I? At any rate, there are respect guidelines. I'm not going to try to recreate it. But the point is, we buy into that as a community. It's posted all over the church so that whether you're the Sierra Club or NA or the vestry, this is the way we do business. This is the way we do business. So when we get into conflict with each other, this is the way we do business. I think that while we may disagree with each other violently, and that may be a source of conflict, we must always treat each other with respect as God's children so that we create space to be safe. And feelings are feelings. They're natural things that we should be able to respect. I expect that when we're in conflict with each other, we talk to each other and not about each other. There's a concept in psychology called triangulation. And so what triangulation means is, it's John, right? I am angry at John. I'm really having trouble with him. So I'm going to talk to Bernie. And then Bernie can talk to John. And then Bernie can tell him how angry I am and how upset that I am with him. We're not going to do that with each other. I will be consistent in not triangulating, and I will expect the clergy to not triangulate because they know better. That's part of our training. And lay leaders, I will expect you not to triangulate either. So if you come to me to complain about somebody else, my first question is maybe, have you talked to John? If he's the one that you're angry with. And until you do that, then don't talk to me about that. You deal with John. Now, the fact that you're calling me about John, and Bernie's calling me about John, and you're calling me about John, I'm going to call John. I'm going to say, John, what's going on here? I've had these calls about you. What do you know? And then I'm going to let John tell me what he knows. And I'm not going to talk to you about John. I'm going to let John talk to you. And if you've said, Bishop, don't tell me who, don't reveal who I am, John will know who you are. Because that's your community, right? I don't have to tell him who you are. And if I do, that's a problem too, right? So then I'm going to say, John, what's up with you that you're not knowing what's going on with your people? What's happening in your own life? Because you should know your people. Especially if they're lay leaders that they know enough to call the bishop. So it's not like outer circle calling unless there's an issue with the person who's calling. So I want to be creating an even playing field. I know that things are complex. I want people to have relations with me so that when conflict arises, because it will, we have enough respect mutually to be able to tell each other the truth in love.
Thank you. What do you see as the first priority of the Bishop of Newark and why?
So I think the first priority is to continue what we have begun today and in this process, which is to build relationships with each other. You need to come to know me, and I need to come to know you. I think that will happen in person. I think that will happen in structured ways. I think that'll happen in me doing research about your communities. both with you and about you. So just so you know, I've already begun that process by talking about you behind your back. But I'm telling you now, so it's not triangulation, right? I called the Lutheran bishop, Tracy Bartholomew. It's the end of the day. Tracy Bartholomew, to say, what's it like to be a woman bishop in New Jersey? And I knew about the work that we are doing with her synod, with the camp ministry, and I'm so excited about that possibility. And so what she had to say is they're great, and it's so wonderful to work with the Episcopal Diocese, and they get all the publicity. I wish we got some. And so your perspective, her perspective on working with you is that you're great. And I want to share that with you as part of the good news of what I'm finding out about the Diocese of Newark. I want to do that personally and relationally. I'm not going to make a promise today that my body and my schedule can't keep. So it may take time to make my way around the diocese, but you're not like Texas. It's not as big. And so I think it's very doable. And I want to come to understand the nuances of your diversity. And that's not theoretical, that's enfleshed. And so I'm going to need to know you as people in your space and in your communities. So that will be one of my highest priorities.
Thank you. I'm going to start by asking you if you received information that we were sending out last night about the lighthouse. Did you get that material?
Yes, I did.
Okay, so the question is about that, and it's given the unification of the Church of the Incarnation with St. Paul's in Jersey City. What are your thoughts about the lighthouse, a ministry that is for asylum seekers, and can that remain viable?
So one of the rituals that we have in my staff meetings, we always begin with prayer, and then the second thing are snaps. And I got that from Reese Witherspoon and Legal Law, right? So we always begin a meeting with snaps to give praise for what we do well, because you can forget what you do well as you focus on what you're not doing so well. And so snaps to those two parishes for having the courage to merge and be unified, not just to be structurally unified internally, but to have the boldness to be able to be unified in mission and ministry. So snaps on that for serving those people, and then triple snaps for being smart enough to use the media well. I listened to the NPR story, good press for that, and I know I heard from someone that financial contributions were coming in to support the ministry because people heard and knew and wanted to do something to respond. My hunch is that guy that wrote the $3,000 check may never darken the door of that ministry, but because you were bold and because you knew how to use the media, he is supporting the ministry of God through you. I won't make any commitment about financial realities that I don't know anything about. Is that an important ministry and a place for the church to be and stand? Absolutely. One of the things about these detention centers that people are not wanting to talk about is they're often owned by for-profit prison industrial complex companies. And I know about this from my life and work in Texas. So I want to just applaud you all for raising awareness of the truth of what we're doing and of the pain and the difficulties of the people that are living there. And I'm really interested to coming and seeing the ministry. And I'm also interested to see if it may be scalable in other areas of the diocese, and might there be other church and other religious groups that might want to replicate the model so that we can respond to the needs of more people.
Thank you. This question is about deacons and diaconal community, their formation, and their role in the church and the larger world.
So, I am ignorant about what the Diocese of Newark is currently doing about the formation of deacons, and that's my bad. But that wasn't information that was shared with me, and that's not criticism of the committee. I can tell from your profile that there's vibrant ministry going on by deacons, and I also know that the reincorporation of that order of ministry is a relatively new thing in the Diocese of Newark. I would want to begin by making relationships with the deacons, because as you may know, deacons report directly to the bishop, and they're an extension of the bishop's ministry throughout the diocese. And their role is to help communicate the needs of the world to the church. You as lay people are called out to do the ministry of God in the world. But the ministry of the deacons are to come back and be part of the church to share with us the needs of the poor and the marginalized particularly, so that the clergy and the people together can be equipped to deal with those ministries in the world, lest we forget the needs of the most marginalized people. So I would want to begin by talking with the deacons. I would want to hear where they feel their gaps are in formation. I would want to see how we might be able to generate resources, people resources and trainings locally that might be effective with them. And then I would just want to learn what's been effective in their formation from their own personal experience, as well as what's not been effective, and how might we respond to that with one another. I think I would also want to talk with the clergy, at the priests, at the communities, at the parishes in which they're based, to see what's working for them within the local context and what the challenges have been. I don't want to second guess, I don't want to reinvent the wheel, and I don't want to criticize or evaluate things that I'm ignorant of.
Thank you. With youth becoming more vocal around issues such as guns, equality, and the environment, how would you support and lift up their voices?
I said to the other group, I don't think we have to lift up their voices very much. They're demanding to be heard. And I think I rejoice in their courage and in their commitment and passion. I think one of the reasons that major reform movements are often led by young people is they don't know to be scared. And if you look at the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, many other movements in the country and around the world, young people are often the ones who can get to the heart of the matter, who garner passion and get mobilized. The challenge for young people often is that they don't know how to organize, and they don't know, they don't have access to resources, both money and people, and experience. I think this is a golden opportunity for the church to come alongside young people and their educators. Those are the other people that are the unsung heroes. Particularly, I want to lift up history and government and economics teachers who are mobilizing these young people and giving them tools to understand the structures. And I think this is a time for the church to come alongside those young people to lend not a hand, but the structure and the resources that they don't have access to. Because we will be seen in that movement as supporters and having been present with them. And real change can happen when we're working conjointly with those who have courage.
Thank you. As bishop, what would you do to raise up young people of color to be priests and deacons?
I think this is a critical need in the church. The Episcopal Church needs to reflect the communities that we serve and where we need to be. So one of the things that I would want to be fostering is working with our communities. I think let me also back up. I think that institutional racism has permeated the way that we do church in America, and we continue to be one of the most segregated places in America. And Martin Luther King said the most segregated hour of the week is at 11 o'clock on Sunday. It might be 5:30 on Saturday these days. It really doesn't matter when it is. I think the challenge of being able to see leaders who look like us is an issue. And the way we talk about it in my congregation is, what are our demographic gaps? Because Houston is the most diverse city in the country. And if we're going to be a welcoming congregation, we've got to look like the city of which we're a part. And so we've been intentional about cultivating visitors and cultivating lay people so that when you're looking at Sunday morning, it looks like who we want to become, not who we are. So I'm going to be looking to our community leaders within the Episcopal Church to say, who do you know? Who do you see having those gifts of ministry? And then one of the really important acts of faith that I think we can do is to be casting seeds In the parable of the sower, there's just a kind of exuberance about the way the sower throws out that seed, not necessarily not controlling where it lands. And I think ministry opportunities are the same way. You throw out the seed, you know that you want what you'd like to have happen, and it may or may not. But I think to privilege what we want to see and what we need to see is the way I would want to go. And I think this is not just going to happen. I think we have to privilege it and make it happen. And I think part of the way we make it happen is make it economically feasible for people to do. And so I would want to be thinking about diocesan resources to help young people go to college and to seminary so that they are not unduly burdened by debt and then not freed up to go serve the congregations and communities that need them most.
Thank you. What are some of the methods you have deployed to strengthen a parish or parishes?
So for me, I think methods can be gimmicks, and I don't believe in gimmicks. I think that the church is a relationship institution. We are the original network. And so I invite you, or you invite me into relationship with each other and with Jesus Christ through the Holy Spirit, and I am changed and you are changed. And because you are changed, you can invite her into relationship with her, and then she is changed because the Holy Spirit's at work amongst us. So that comes from taking time to deeply listen to one another and to cultivate spiritual practices that allow us to be fully human. Our congregations should be places where we practice being fully human, because in our families and in our workplaces and in our neighborhoods and in our country, we may not be fully human. We may not be able to be truly ourselves and who God calls us to be. But in the household of God, we should be able to learn how to be fully who we are. So that's about building relationships and spiritual practices that invite us into deep intimacy with God and with one another. And that's about, for me, learning how to make safe spaces for us to offer ourselves and to disagree and to take risks and to not be judged. That the church should be a safe place for everyone who comes to it. Then, having had the benefit of that, I think then we share it out. And I think we go out, and y'all are already practicing that, so I don't need to talk to you about that. But I think the other practice that's important is that our worship and our formation as Christians and as adults, starting as children, but extending into our adulthood, we're always on the pilgrim's path to learning and growing into the full stature of Christ. And so I think that our ministries need to nurture that journey. One of the things I'm excited about is I turn 59 tomorrow, and the fruit of my white hair is that my spirit is deepening. And I'm realizing that as I get older, part of my responsibility is to be nurturing others and giving them faith, hope, and love. That it's not just for me alone, that my faith is to share and to be able to empower the next generation. And my hope out of our congregations that have a lot of white hair is that we are mature. And that it's not for ourselves alone, but that it's for our families and for our communities and for our world, because God will be known through us.
Thank you. Could you please speak a little bit about lay ministry in our diocese and how that works in congregations?
So lay people are the ministers of the church. And I think that clergy exists to empower lay people to do their ministries in the world. I think it is naive and wrong theology in an Episcopal way to expect the diocese to be the church. We are the church. We are the church together. I think that to be effective, the diocese needs to be engaged with the lay leadership to empower them and to know what formation opportunities, what resources, what what means we can do together to empower your ministry. And it's not just about institutional maintenance in the church, it's about who you are and what you do every day. And I think to be open to your needs and getting input on that is important. I think the exciting thing about coming into the 21st century church is that it's not about programs anymore. It's about transformation of souls and engagement with others. And so I think you will know what you need. I think my job, if I'm elected your bishop, is to create space and vehicles for you to convey what you need, and then ways that together we can mobilize to address those needs so that you're able to do your ministry in your place and in your time.
And along those lines, what might be one of those vehicles or ways for the bishop to make the teachings of the church relevant to younger people?
I think bishops are completely irrelevant to younger people. So I don't have visions of grandeur. I think what they care about are leaders with integrity who are modeling authenticity in authority. And so I think the way that I can most commend the ministry that is the bishops is to be a person that is modeling authority with integrity and to be a voice and a presence in places that young people care about. And the church is not one of those places that they care about right now. So I think what we've got to be paying attention to is where are they caring? And we show up there. One of the places that I've shown up recently in my own ministry, and this was so deeply uncomfortable, was at City Hall in Houston. What was the issue? I blanked on it, which is a sign of how traumatic it was for me on a certain level. So it was a public meeting where Indivisible Houston was pulling together different groups around, it wasn't a political party issue, but it was a political access issue. In Texas, voters' rights restrictions are that's one of the biggest dangers the democracy has. So these young people had organized this meeting, and there was a variety of groups there. Black Lives Matter was there, there was a Latino rights organization, there was somebody else there. And I realized as I walked up that they didn't know church at all. And so it was like, who are you, woman with white hair, showing up? But the people they treated me with respect and welcome. And I think there were others in the crowd who knew who I was and who were glad to see me. But I realized at that point, the only credibility I have is how I'm embodied and in the relationships that we have, not in the positional power, because that has evaporated a long time ago. It's all about our witness and who we're willing to partner with and the networks of which we're willing to be conjoined. And that's a risk-taking thing for me personally and for us, I think, institutionally.
You've talked a couple of times about working in conjunction with other faith traditions. Is there anything else you'd like to say about that?
So what I would say about that is we're not going to agree about everything. And I don't think we should get hung up about that. I think we need to work on what is the good and what is the common good and how do we create common good for our communities. So I may violently disagree with you about your understanding of the role of women, for example, but if we are willing to work on this detention issue together so that women and children and male refugees who are being treated as persona non grata are treated instead like human beings, I don't care whether you respect my ordination or not. If we can agree on this action, then I'm for you. And I think that we need to be handling these differences while they're important and real, not as the central thing. Because I think we cannot count on common values or common traditions anymore. We're in too pluralistic of a world. Religion is seen as a vehicle of hatred and division and oppression. And our witness has to be modeling one of being peacemakers, one of being respectful, one of caring for the poor, deeper values that we can all get to and agree on. The other issues may be important for a secondary day, but when we're dealing with the foundations, what we have in common, to me, is more important than where we disagree.
Thank you. How do people in your congregation feel about the potential of losing you to the Diocese of Newark?
I'm really glad that you asked that question. So to my face, they say, what a great opportunity for you. I think my director of music is much more candid. She said, I am praying you don't get it. And I think I appreciate her honesty. My predecessor at St. Stephen's in Houston was Helen Havens, the first woman rector in the Diocese of Texas. She was the rector there for 22 years, and in her office she had a poster that said, a woman's place is in the House of Bishops. And so Helen groomed this community of faith, that inclusion across gender lines was really important, and she offered herself in those early days for consideration as a bishop. So the table was laid for me way before Newark invited me into this process for our role as a congregation on raising up leaders of all kinds of difference. So I think I will be deeply missed. I think most people don't want me to go yet. I know that it would be a struggle for me to leave. But I also know that if God calls us together, a way will be made, and that all will be well for them and for me.
Thank you. Now for a fun question.
Okay.
So, and everyone's received the same fun question. Other than your family and your friends, what is something that you love or love to do?
So what I love to do is cook, and I especially like to cook with ingredients that I've grown. And in Houston, it's kind of hard in some ways. So for example, the thing that I'm most excited about coming to New Jersey about, not the most thing, but a most thing, is to be able to grow a decent tomato and be able to cook with that. So in Texas, I'm lucky if I get little cherry tomatoes to produce. And so right now, I'm confined to hot peppers and herbs. And so I can make those stretch pretty far, but you know there's nothing like a fresh tomato.
Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you sharing this part of your journey with us. And we will hold you and all the candidates in our prayers.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for this call.